Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Anjan, a friend who's loosely connected. We've heard of each other perhaps and run into each other virtually, but we'll meet finally in London later this month. Uh, I wrote a small blurb about him of his journey from being the suitable boy to slightly less suitable, and we're going to explore why that happened, how that happened, um, and we're going to discuss his latest book, which is titled Breakup. So, Anjan, let's get started. Welcome to Network Capital. Tell us a bit about your book. Why is it titled the way it is?
Oh, thank you, Utkarsh. It's a pleasure to be here and lovely to connect visually for the first time and then in person later this month. So the new book is the third in a series of books that I've written about memoirs about journalism in Africa. And the new book is titled Breakup because it both describes how my marriage and my relationships, my family, enabled my reporting and allowed me to go out and do the war reporting, the kind of war reporting that I did. In this case, in the Central African Republic, there had been rumors of genocide that were building up there, and it was really my family and my marriage that gave me the courage to step out and go and do that reporting. But ultimately, as happens with many reporters and frontline human rights workers, the work then damaged the marriage. And I wanted to describe that because these personal stories are very rarely told. As journalists, we're trained to turn our cameras upon the world, but we rarely do so upon ourselves. And when I'm reading stories, watching a good documentary, reading a good book, reading a good report, I always wonder who is this reporter, and why are they obsessed with this character? Why are they obsessed with this story? Who are their parents? Where did they grow up? Did they lose somebody? What drives them to often take risks to report this story? And I wanted to answer those questions for readers in my own books.
On Network Capital, we focus on all age segments, but primarily millennials and Gen Zs, because both Gen Zs and millennials have to take multiple career transitions. I believe you're still a millennial. Could you tell us a bit about how you became such an unsuitable boy from IIT and Yale to Grand Écoles in France to journalism in Africa? I think it'll be a middle class Indian parent horror, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, totally. My parents were shocked, and you can imagine. Yeah, in many ways, I had followed a well-trodden path that would have led me, I don't know, to a big American
Hedge fund
multinational
in New
Google.
York.
Yes, Goldman Sachs, and I had a
Yeah.
job at Goldman Sachs, as a mathematician. And all my studies in India, you're sort of pushed often towards the sciences, and so I studied engineering. Done well in all the exams, like you had mentioned. Went to Yale, studied math, and it all culminated in a certain sense in a job at Goldman Sachs. And I can describe what that moment was like. I sort of I went up to accept the offer, and I went up their skyscraper, and I looked down at the city, and I thought, oh my God, you've got to pay me a lot of money to work here. And of course, they were paying a lot of money, so it wasn't an easy decision. But uh, yeah, I don't know. The whole story goes, I took a writing class at Yale. I realized this is what I wanted to do. I just didn't know how to get to that place to be able to write for a living. And I remember opening the newspaper one lunch, the New York Times, and in the middle of the newspaper, bottom of the page, there was a story about how 5 million people had died in Congo. And it struck me, and I thought, how come this isn't on the front page? And one thing led to the next, and soon as I bought a one-way ticket to Kinshasa, and with no journalism experience, I sort of showed up and began to try to learn journalism, just with the conviction that whatever was happening in Congo should make the news and should be more prominent. And if there weren't that many journalists in the world's largest war, then I saw an opportunity in that, and I thought, maybe I can make my career here. Yeah, and it's it's tricky to describe the relationship with my parents. My parents sent me to school in India. It's called Rishi Valley. It was founded by Jiddu Krishnamurti. It's a very free-thinking, free-spirited school. We didn't have uniforms. We didn't have exams. Teachers would come in, read a book, read 2 pages out of a book, and discuss the book, and that was class. And they really kind of encouraged you to pursue your dreams and your passions. And I think that's kind of what I did. I kind of, as long as I didn't know what I wanted to do, I studied math, I studied engineering, I did all the right things, and I, did them well. But and in some ways, though, that path gave me a foundation from which to launch myself and take, in my perception at least, less risk, because I always had something to come back to. As a mathematician, I felt like I could always come back to a big corporation. I could come back to corporate America, a corporate job, and that gave me the courage to go out. And of course, I never came back. But I think the knowledge that I could come back was vital and really important. That kind of safety net. And I think that's maybe underemphasized, understated in many stories of people taking risk. You need a safety net, and in many ways, Breakup, my new book, is about that. Family and home is a place I can always come back to in my mind when I'm out reporting in these wars. And I'm always thinking, should I go forward? Should I turn back? And I need a place to go back to. And I never end up going back home until my job is done. But it's vital to me psychologically to know that I could come back. I could go home. And I can seriously consider that. And then I can think to myself, do I really want to go home now? And I often tell myself, no, I'll try to go a little bit further. I'll try a little bit further, but I might retreat back home. But often when you go a little bit further, as you've probably experienced yourself, you go a little bit further and then realize you can't go back. And then you go a little bit further, a little more, and then you a little more. And then finally, 5 or 10 years later, you realize you've traveled this unusual original path. And you're very thankful that you lived your life in that way. But the safety nets, I think, are at least for me, really important. To know I could go back and potentially start out again, from that place. And yeah, so that's kind of the process. It's not like, some grand idea. I read the newspaper in the New York Times and I was like, and I read about the Congo and I was like, okay, I'm going to the Congo. I'm going to become this journalist. I'm going to write a book. No, it's little baby steps, one step at a time. And I think having the relationships, the family, the friends, partner, to be able to, find that courage, that little bit of courage that you need to take the little next step, that's what's key. And that's what I try to convey in all my books. I always try to write about my books. My first book, Stringer, second book's called Bad News, and the third book's called Breakup. I always start those journeys from the point at which I didn't know much about the country. I'm like you, the reader. I don't know much about this country. I read a piece of news. Maybe I have a couple of connections, more than you have. But I want the reader to feel what I feel in starting to plan that journey, taking that risk, taking those little steps, one step at a time. I want to take the reader on that journey with me. And maybe they can't in their lives because they have families, they have jobs, they have, all kinds of constraints. But I feel that at base, that's the journey I want to take them with me on, because that might give them courage and inspire them to take little baby steps in whatever direction, some other direction. But I think that's what's common, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a journalist like I was, like I am, or like I was starting out to be when I had just graduated. Whatever experience you're living, and you're trying to take risks, you're putting yourself out there. That's the core of the experience I want to convey. And mine just happens to be in conflicts in Central Africa with my particular background. I try to be transparent. This is who I am. These are my prejudices. This is my background. This is my education. Come with me on the journey if you want to. I'm not pretending to tell some universal truth, but I think in that specificity, I try to tell a universal story about having a dream, having a vision, and trying to taking that risk and trying to make that come true. And in the process, like many businesses, like many people who take risks, like trying to find some way to be useful and feel like my life is worthwhile.
So from saving the world with hedge funds and venture capital to perhaps writing about a different part of of life, I think your career has really taken on quite a turn, I would say. I believe a former professor of yours, William Dershowitz, he's written about solitude. One of his most interesting books is about how Yale students are excellent sheep. And he basically talks about homogenization of choices and how people in their college essays usually talk about saving the world and providing safe drinking water in underserved parts, and after that find their true calling in in investing, of course. And I think your career is quite the contrary, and I found that to be very interesting. So in addition to excellent titles that your books have, I thought that your personal identity comes across in each of them. You're able to convey your story as well as the story of the places that you're talking about. So we're going to come to that. But let me talk a bit about your influences early on. So tell me a bit about your supervisor at Yale.
So I had a couple, one of whom I mentioned in my first book, and the other one whom I haven't mentioned. But uh, my mathematics professor, his name was Serge Lang, and he sort of he helped me go really fast in mathematics. He saw that I had an interest, and I skipped all the undergraduate courses when I was an undergraduate at Yale, and I took the master's courses straight away. And he would help me, he would give me the master's textbooks. He would help me navigate and understand these higher level courses um, without the necessary prerequisites. And so I was doing mathematics in an accelerated way. I remember one day I went to his office. I was in my senior year, final year at Yale, and I told him, "Sir, I'm not going to do a PhD in mathematics. I'm going to Congo." And he just smiled, and he was like, he said to me, "You're playing the fool," but he said it in a playful way. And he said, "I understand." And he pulled out an old edition from the '60s of Rolling Stone magazine, and he handed it to me, and he said, "I understand. I was in the protests in Berkeley in the '60s against the Vietnam War, and what you're doing is important. So you should go and follow your passion, and you should do that." And that was an important influence. And the second mentor, who I don't mention in Stringer, but who was also important, his name was Professor Peter Kindelman, and he was my undergraduate advisor. He'd known me for 4 years. And I said, when I got the Goldman Sachs job, I went to Professor Kindelman and I said, "Professor, I have this great idea. I'm going to go to Goldman Sachs. I'm going to work for 5 years, make $1 million, and then I'm going to go and travel and write." And he said to me, "Great plan. You'll be a different person in 5 years. You may not want to travel." And I thought about it. That it just hit me in that moment. I thought about it and I said, he's right. I can totally imagine myself in 5 years. I've made the money that I wanted, but now I want the house in the Hamptons. Now I want, I don't know, the bright colored socks that bankers wear. Whatever it is, I want the fancy car. I could totally see myself getting pulled into that life and feeling so far away from this dream of traveling and writing, which I had at the time. But it was still a dream. Uh, that it concerned me that I wouldn't do it, and I thought to myself, "Professor's right. If I want to do it, I need to do it now." And so what I did was, I ended up getting a job at McKinsey, and they were I told both McKinsey and Goldman, I said, "I want to go to Congo," and Goldman said, "Oh, we don't know if we'll need you next year, so reapply." And McKinsey said, "Oh, we'll just change your color on the spreadsheet. We'll want you even more if you have life experience in Congo." And so I thought, okay, with that backup, with that sort of safety net, I can go out and I can go and try to make myself a journalist in Congo. And so again, these mentors were really important for me to help me listen to that little voice in my head, that said, you need to go out. This is what you love to do. And it's not always an easy path. No path is easy. And I think one of the fallacies of our minds is that we tell ourselves that this is going to be an easier path. It's never easy. Life is never easy. No matter what path you take, you're going to question yourself. You're going to wonder if you're doing the right thing, and you're going to, I think, face challenges about, self-actualization, about fulfilling yourself, about, are you doing what you're meant to be doing, what you're born to be doing? And money and all those concerns of security and all those kinds of things, they're always going to come up. And so, yeah, I think we fool ourselves into taking sometimes a path we don't want to because we tell ourselves it will give us more security. And in reality, you're gonna face the hard questions no matter what. And so I think the advice from my advisors went down well. I went out, I had a taste of, Congo, of the journalist life. I came back to McKinsey for 2 years because I realized how hard it is to make a living and, sustain yourself as a freelance reporter, as a freelance writer. And so having a foot in both worlds um, somehow helped me take those steps one at a time. And I worked at McKinsey for 2 years, and since then I haven't gone back. But knowing that I could is still something important to me. It's sometimes in moments of crisis, because as an artist, you want to take risks. You want to tell stories. You want to tell the stories that you're not sure about. You're not sure if they'll sell. You're not sure if it'll resonate with people, and you're not sure if, like, your next book, maybe it'll be your fourth, fifth book that does so. And so you want to be able to take those risks. And I think to do that, you need either, you're independently wealthy, you have an inheritance, you have a trust fund, you have parents who are very supportive, you've inherited an apartment or something like that. None of those were the case for me. So I had to build that safety net on my own, and try to live this creative life. And I think more and more people, especially in India is rising now. There's 50% of the countries under 25. More and more people are asking themselves these kinds of questions. How do I live a fulfilled life? And more people have access to this kind of the world. And I'm excited for what that'll bring. Hopefully more South-South connections, more, my generation, we had to read the BBC and the New York Times to get news about Africa. Hopefully that won't be the case. Hopefully there'll be more Indians and more Africans and more East Asians and, South Asians, and, reporting on each other. And the world will be more interconnected, and we will feel not connected to each other necessarily through the West, but organically. Our nations are more connected through trade, economically, but also culturally and through the news. That would make me really happy. And I see, we're maybe on the cusp of that.
Awesome, Anjan. Despite the breakup and other changes that have happened in your life, you seem happy. Why?
uh, I don't know. I think, for all that we spoke about our parents and my parents, the Indian nightmare, the Indian parents' nightmare to have a kid, turn down a job at Goldman Sachs, and
And
go
McKinsey, and finally went back to McKinsey. Imagine if you turned that back down. I think they'd disown you.
Well, in the moment they were worried because I did turn it down in the moment. They're always worried. Oh, he says he's going to come back. Is he actually going to come back? Is this just a ploy? But no, I think, from each of my parents, I got different things. And from my mom, I got this feeling that I'm loved. And I think that's what I try to convey in Breakup. These relationships, the sense of being loved, the sense of having family, having connections, it's priceless. And that's what allows you to go out and, do other things, take risks. And from my father, I got this sense of ambition, need to, a taste for migration, to travel, to construct myself through travel, because my father had moved to Dubai before I was born, and that's where I grew up for the first 10 years of my life. So I inherited these things from my father, this sense of the world and ambition. But from my mother, I inherited, and this has taken me longer to realize, just a sense that, I'm loved. And I see this because she's transmitting it to my daughter. And I can see how my daughter, who's 10 years old now, absolutely feels loved and has no problem, conveying to my mother that she loves her, and it's pure, it's complete. And I can now remember, in seeing my daughter, how I had experienced that as a kid. And I think that's just that's where all creativity comes from. I think, when you feel content and fulfilled yourself, then you can think about, oh, what can I do? What can I do for other people? What can I do? What do I want to do in the world? Who do I want to be? If you don't have that, then I think you try to fill that void. You try to, find money, find success, find status, and all those concerns are still there because that's what society trains you and conditions you to want. But in those quiet moments, when you ask yourself who you are, when you feel connected with yourself, and I know you've written about some of this yourself. Trying to tap into who you are and what you really want to do. There's nothing as rewarding as that, and I have to thank my parents, my mom and my parents, for both those inheritances that I've gotten from them. I've written about my father because I think that's that's a more difficult one. That's a more angsty relationship, and it's easier to think about those and dwell on those and write about those. And what I received from my mother is quieter, and it's taken me longer to consider that, think about that, and recognize and appreciate that. And I'd like to write about it. And I actually 2 days ago, I asked myself the same question that you asked me, and I wrote the first paragraph of a story about my mom, a piece of an essay about my mom, and how important it's been, what I've received from her, but how difficult also it is to perceive that, recognize that, acknowledge it, and say thank you. And I turned 40 this year, and maybe turning 40 is sort of a milestone, and maybe it sort of provoked. My mom made a video for me, all these people in my life who'd passed through my life. I think it made me reflect on all the people who'd helped me, and what really at its foundation drives creative work and drives fulfilling work. My friends wrote to me, and they're also turning 40, obviously, my closest friends from childhood, from school. And they wrote to me and they said, we're not going to take money with us when we die. We're not going to carry a suitcase full of stuff. So what are we doing? And somehow they turned to me, and because I made some of these choices early on, and we're having these deeper conversations about what we really want to do, who we want to be. We all come from a certain degree of privilege, which, I think of privilege as a safety net. If you have that safety net, then what can you do with it? And that's the question, how we, can judge ourselves, or, measure ourselves, or think about what we're doing. I don't see it as a burden necessarily. I see it as a safety net, and as an opportunity. What can we do with this privilege that we've received? How can we live a fulfilled life for ourselves, and do something that we feel is meaningful? And that's really what I try to get across in the book. You say that I write about myself.
Yeah, difficult conversations have been such an important part of your life as a writer, as a journalist, but also as a son, as a friend, as a spouse, in various relationships. Talk to me about some of the most difficult conversations that you've had in your personal life, and what would you learn from them? And then we'll move on to your book, the specific aspects of it.
Oh, sure. I mean, maybe the most difficult conversation I had was, the conversation at the end of Breakup, which is with my ex-wife now. And when we had a daughter, she really began to rethink who she was, who I was, and she wanted me to be a more traditional father and husband, 9-to-5 job, going out, doing my work, being present. That's what she wanted. She said a father, a husband needs to be present for the child, for the family.
Demand, I would say.
No, not an unfair demand at all. She had been a war correspondent as well. That's where we'd met on the front line of the war in Congo. She knew intimately my work. Before we'd had the child, we discussed whether I could continue my work, and we'd both agreed that we would. And yeah, I think just after having a kid, you change in certain ways. You change in ways that you don't anticipate, and people change, and that's the hard thing, and you have to accept it. And that was a very difficult change in her for me to accept. And as you say, it's not unreasonable. And in the book, I try to describe her point of view as completely as I can, and that's why this book took so long to write, because the marriage was so precious to me. And to write about something so beautiful that I had lost without feeling resentful that I had lost it, that took time. And I wanted to do it justice. I wanted to do it, give it its due, and write about its beauty. Yeah, I'd say that's maybe the hardest conversation I've had to have, because the other conversation with my parents, my friends, there's a precedent. There's a rebellious kid. There's you rebel against your parents and you forge your own path. That's a timeless story. But a story of a father, a husband who leaves, that's a far more difficult story. That's not a story that's been written about a lot, and it's written about maybe when it has, unkindly. And I wanted to explore all of the complications in that. And my ex-wife and I, we've overcome some of those conversations. We have a good relationship now. We're both raising our daughter together. But at the time, it was maybe the hardest thing for me to swallow. That if I had to, I felt like she was asking me to choose between my daughter, who's a part of myself, part of me, and she was choose between that and my work, which is also a part of me. And I had to give up one or the other. And I felt it was a really unfair choice, unfair position to put me in. And that was very, very difficult to understand and very difficult to get advice on, find mentors. We spoke about my professors at Yale. I asked other men, older men, divorcees, how they'd handle it, other reporters. I got very bad advice. There was a lot of resentment, a lot of anger. Somehow society hasn't found a way to talk about these things, I find. For men to talk about it, for families to talk about it, for war correspondents, to discuss these kinds of things. And I think, my story is not unique. There's so many frontline human rights defenders, journalists who've lived the same story, but don't talk about it because it's hard, and it's hard society also doesn't want to listen to it necessarily. And part of the purpose of this book was just to open that conversation, not say that I have the answers, but this is my story. This is my little contribution to explaining and expressing what happened. And how do we as reporters, as frontline human rights workers, as public servants, all these categories of work that take a toll on families, how do we talk about this? How do we speak about this openly with our families before the drama happens, so that we're all more aware of the path down which this kind of work leads us. I just saw that as a kind of a blind spot, and through my story and telling the story, also talking about the work, the reporting, what's happening in the Central African Republic, a forgotten war, another one, and trying to tell both those stories in the same way, illuminate both those dark areas in personal lives and in the globe, together.
Thank you for your candor, Anjan. I know that this must not have been super easy to talk about, but I'm glad you did, both in the book and in this, podcast that goes out to millions of people. It's very important to share how we make difficult decisions, have difficult conversations. And somebody once told me that success in life comes down to the number of difficult conversations one is willing to have. And another person told me is that, of all the people you can choose to disappoint, you should choose to disappoint yourself the least. So I think lots to unpack here, which we shall when we meet in London. But I just want to, take a segue into the next part of our discussion. Unless you have a final reflection on this difficult conversation or anything else that we've discussed leading up to this.
It's a very rich, topic, as you say, and I'm sure thoughts will come to me as we speak. So let's carry on.
Just feel free to share them anytime. Talk to me about Syria and Central Africa. What's similar? What's different? What's something that people should know about both of these regions, but they often ignore?
So at the time that I went to the Central African Republic, Syria was on the front page of most newspapers. Those wars broke out at similar times. They seemed on a similar scale, affecting similar numbers of people. And yet there was a stark disparity. Syria was on the front page and the Central African Republic was nowhere. When I asked editors to, send me to report on this war in the Central African Republic, which affected 4 million people, thousands of people had been killed, very little news coming out. They asked me which Central African Republic. They didn't know which country I was talking about. There was no sense. And, I wrote about this today, actually, in an article in Foreign Policy magazine, that, editors, especially in the West, there's a sense of authority about the news. And that, I believe that kind of leads to also sense of ignorance about the news's blind spots. When I bring up the Central African Republic, which is a blind spot in the news, the editors think that because it's not being covered, maybe it's not important. And that's not true. It's not being covered for a host of other reasons, but it should be covered and it's important. And where the Central African Republic and Syria maybe now are like is that, despite all those reporters who went to Syria when the war broke out and covered that conflict, now it's disappeared. It's disappeared, and Bashar al-Assad, the president, dictator of Syria, is now being welcomed back into the fold. The Arab League. He's basically seems to have won. He seems to have won not only the war, but also a battle for his status to no longer be a pariah. And this is what inattention does in Syria, in the Central African Republic. It gives perpetrators a free hand. When there are witnesses, just people showing up, just journalists showing up, it can do so much to tie the hands of these perpetrators and ensure that these wars don't cross a line. Extreme violence is not perpetrated on people. And so that's some of the those are some of the similarities and differences between those two wars. The Central African Republic briefly made the front pages, when there was the ethnic cleansing of Muslims there. But again, the journalists just leave, and this is the model of international news that we are now receiving our news from. When news breaks out, all the journalists show up there at the same time to report more or less the same thing. And then when that news is deemed, that place is deemed unimportant, all of them leave at the same time, and then suddenly it's shrouded in darkness. And so all the perpetrators have to do is wait for the journalists to leave, because they're going to at some point, and then they can carry on doing their work in darkness, in obscurity, and get what they want. And that I believe is a serious failing of the news. And that's kind of what I, at that time, when I went to the Central African Republic, very few people were covering it. There were almost no African reporters. Central African local reporters couldn't travel out because they often lacked the resources, the car, the money, all that kind of stuff. The radio antenna in the countryside had been destroyed by the government. So news didn't come from the countryside about massacres, about killings, to the capital. And there were a couple of foreign reporters from the Guardian, and who came for a week, who came for a short time, did a couple of reports and left. And so that was a situation in which I and a colleague of mine, Lewis from Human Rights Watch, we drove through the country, and we ended up kind of discovering, on the one hand, killings, massacres, and all this violence that wasn't being reported and should be reported. But we also found in each place, we found heroic figures who, in obscurity, were, whether it could be a cobbler who was stitching up people's sandals and shoes so that they could flee into the forest. And the cobbler was not fleeing himself. He was waiting it out and helping the others before he fled, so that the others could flee. That's an act of heroism. And then there was a Polish priest who drove out into this war zone and would collect information by hand from village to village of who was sick, who had been killed, who needed medicines, who needed food, was their water contaminated, what did they need from aid organizations. And he would bring this news back to the capital and transmit it to the NGOs so that they could send that aid. And he was doing this alone in his little pickup, and that for me is war correspondence. And he was a priest, a church priest. Another priest, she made herself a human shield, against the government. So in each place there are these heroic, very powerful figures who are really the core of why I write the book. If I don't find them, then it's so bleak. But in this bleakness, there are these powerful, amazing figures. In my second book, it was Rwandan journalists, who were standing up to the government, the dictatorship, and putting everything on the line, their families, their wealth, their lives, to report on the government's abuses of power. And so these are the people who inspire me to write books, and write about their stories, because often their stories are not told. They're not, Western enough. They're not, I don't know. There's so many reasons. They're African. They're, obscure. They're poor. they seem to, people think that they live in remote places, and so their stories are not told. And I think they're some of the bravest people in the world. Their stories deserve to be told. And in many ways, my journeys are journeys, that I make to find these figures, because they're always there. Whether in Syria, whether in Central African Republic, there are always these figures who give up everything, who find a calling and help other people save lives, putting themselves in the line of fire. And that's the human spirit, I think. In our bleakest moments, in our darkest times, we find a reason to continue, a purpose, a calling, something that calls to us and persuades us to give up a lot of things, a lot of security, a lot of comforts, and to go out and do something that we feel we don't ask any questions. When we're doing that kind of work, we know we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, and that's just a reward you can't put a price on.
Tell us a bit about Rwanda, because the West and most of the world, parts of South Asia, also gushing over the development. And I feel that you take a contrarian perspective. Tell us where you come from, and what's one thing that people should pay attention to, but they often miss.
So the adulation and the praise for Rwanda today is no different from the praise that the Rwandan government received in the years before the tragic 1994 genocide in Rwanda. At that point as well, Rwanda was a donor darling. It was receiving aid from the World Bank, from Western governments. It was praised as an island of peace in a sea of instability. It was praised for its efficient government programs in the health sector, in the education sector. And yet, we saw genocide, a tragic genocide in which 1 million Rwandans, mostly Tutsis, were killed. The Tutsis were targeted in that genocide in 1994. And I think it's very little has changed in that fundamental way today. Rwanda on the surface is very organized. It's very, it looks like it's developing. But the fact is, back then and today, it is and it has been a dictatorship. And it's not a surprise that dictatorships can build schools, build roads, build hospitals. Bashar al-Assad did that in Syria. Gaddafi did that in Libya. Saddam Hussein did that in Iraq. The problem is the concentration of power in Rwanda today, in Paul Kagame, the president, in the dictatorship in Rwanda, should give us all reason for concern. In any country, it should give us reason for concern, but especially in Rwanda, because in the past, that concentration of power has led to, historically, ethnic cleansing, ethnic targeting of Tutsis, and then genocide in 1994. And so the stakes in Rwanda are just so much higher. I think right now, presidents and leaders like Paul Kagame benefit from what I think of as a wave of post-colonial support for populists. Paul Kagame stands up to the West. He calls out the West for colonial crimes. And in many parts of the world, including India, where we come from, there's a hunger for leaders who speak about Western crimes, that Western hypocrisy. And I think there's such a thirst for leaders who stand up to the West and say these things that we've been all been wanting to hear for so long, that people are willing to look away from the crimes. And that's happening in India, that's happening in Rwanda, that's happening in Mexico, that's happening in Turkey. It's happening all over the world. There's such a hunger for a post-colonial order whereby nations in the global South, former colonies, stand up for themselves, craft their own identities. And I sympathize and I understand that, coming from India myself. I support that. I just think it's unfortunate that in trying to craft that independent identity around our nations and our peoples, we're giving a free hand to some of these leaders, and we're allowing them to perpetrate crimes. And there's credible evidence, and there has been for many decades, of Paul Kagame's crimes in Rwanda, in Congo. We're talking possibly hundreds of thousands of deaths, crimes, killings that the UN investigators have classified as possible acts of genocide themselves. So Paul Kagame himself could be, culpable of that. and he's been given a free hand because of Rwanda's tragic past. And many people feel that Rwandans are content with Kagame because he's bringing economic development, they're happy for the peace, which is so precious in the shadow of the genocide. But that's not true. Many Rwandans have fought to build a more democratic nation in Rwanda, to build the kind of institutions that will prevent a future incidents of violence, or ethnic cleansing, or possibly genocide. They want that, and they've given their lives for it in many cases. And many of them are now living in exile because Paul Kagame has refused to give up power. And so many of these brave Rwandans are now, giving on lecture tour in the US instead of helping to build their nation. And Kagame, like many dictators, many leaders, has crafted this myth around himself as the savior of Rwanda. And I think we should all be suspicious when any person says that they're the savior of a nation, that the nation cannot exist or cannot continue without them. That's a failure of governance, of leadership. A real success of leadership and governance is to build institutions so that, when they're gone, and everybody goes at some point, there's a peaceful transition of power. And Kagame has put Rwanda in a situation today where, like many dictatorships, the most likely consequence is that there will be violence when he hands over power. It won't be a peaceful. Rwanda's never had a peaceful transition of power, and it looks like Kagame is setting up the country for another violent transition of power. He's grooming his kids to take over, and all of these things we've seen this so many times before, where dictatorships lead us, and we should just be really concerned. And if we care about the Rwandan people and their future and their right to have a peaceful future, then Kagame has clearly failed in that respect.
Thank you. Tell us about some of the important but underlooked geopolitical lessons from Breakup. Conceptually, what's the new worldview you want millennials and Gen Zs to learn about?
It's interesting. The Central African Republic taught me that, what happened with colonization, our nations haven't forgotten. So before the French came and colonized Central Africa, and the Central African Republic, by the way, the French came, there was a powerful leader called Rabi al-Zubair, and he had a powerful kingdom called the Dar al-Kuti, which means the door to the forest. And the French came, they defeated him, he resisted, but they defeated him, they beheaded him and held his head up as a trophy. So it was very brutal. And then the French took over, and for the last 100 years, we've kind of taken for granted that Central Africa and the Central African Republic is a francophone part of the world. We've forgotten that Muslim history, Islamic history in that region, but the Muslims haven't of that region. And so the whole war in the Central African Republic was started by a small group of Muslim rebels and fighters who wanted to recapture that glory from that past. And I see this all around the world. All around the world, our nations, former colonies, we want to recapture that sense of glory that we had before Western nations came and took over our countries and transformed our nations and told us that our histories were primitive, were savage, and that the West was a symbol of progress, and that we should all aspire to be like the West. And I see that's one of the big lessons that I see from my reporting there, that so many nations are now wanting to shake off the West, and they're willing to start conflicts and perpetuate conflicts in order to do that. Now in the Central African Republic, the Muslims they took over power. The rebels that I spoke about, they took over power in the Central African Republic. They were defeated by the Christian majority, but they succeeded in another sense, in the sense that France pulled out of the Central African Republic. It's pulled out its troops, and it left a void. And Russia has entered that void. And the Wagner Group is active in the Central African Republic. They're mining gold and diamonds, and they're using that money to finance their war in Ukraine. And there are many similarities. Ukraine is trying to push back the West and NATO. Russia is trying to push back NATO and the West from its borders. And here in the Central African Republic, these Muslims are trying to push back and push out the French. And there's now more of this post-colonial order that I see. Russia, China, India, they're all trying to form alliances and trying to, create a new world order that is not Western dominated. And I think this has profound implications for business, for culture, for identity, for a host of things. The West, we're entering a multipolar world, and many of these nations are willing to take great risks to put their nations into a new world order, to shun the West, shun the lucrative contracts that come with the West, with Western support. And that's the main thing. And in a sense, I understand it. The generation I grew up in, we had to go. My father asked me when I was growing up, where do you want to go when you grow up? Do you want to go to Europe or America? Both those places for him were symbols of success. And then I went to Congo, which for him was a symbol of failure, a failed nation. Why would you go there? And I think that's a journey that our generations,
After
Gen
Yale
Zs,
and
millennials. Yes, so I went to the West, following my parents' wishes. But I think our generations are now looking to other parts of the world. We see the world is not just dominated by Western interests and Western authority and cultural supremacy. We're trying to build ourselves and make our futures, make our destinies in many other parts of the world. And I feel like my story kind of bridges that. Because I kind of followed my parents' path and then I broke away from it. And but I think it's going to become more and more commonplace. I think we're going to see other parts of the world as places of opportunity, as places of success, possible success in different ways. We're going to redefine what success means, and I think these are all beautiful things. And I think that's what speaks to our generation more. And like I mentioned, half of Africa is under 25, half of India is under 25. New ways
a
of
lot
seeing
of
the world.
investing is going on in Africa as well. So you never know. I mean, a lot of economic potential can also be unpacked there.
Absolutely.
So Anjan and I are not here to discuss advanced geopolitics or anything yet, and neither are we proposing one particular worldview. But Anjan, many people may not know about the Wagner Group. Do you want to explain the business model and how things work a bit more
Sure.
slowly, so that everyone can get a sense of how that group works and what is the significance of it, before moving on to any other lesson that you want to talk about?
Sure. Yeah, I can just briefly mention. So the Wagner Group is a mercenary group that has now become crucial in Russia's war on Ukraine, and it was started by a man who used to cater to Putin in the Kremlin, and he used to cater food. But now he's become the head of a mercenary group, and they have been active in the fight for Bakhmut in the last weeks, a strategic city in the east of Ukraine, and they've been used as a proxy army by Putin and by Russia. And what's happening is that they've constructed a business model whereby they are now providing security services as mercenaries to many African nations, including the Central African Republic. They provide, they train the Central African Republic army, they provide bodyguards to the Central African president, and in return, they get mining concessions. And so they mine lucrative gold and diamonds. And they use this for their military operations everywhere. Right now, most prominently in Ukraine. And so this multipolar world that we're talking about, it's not just an abstract desire, it's having very real effects on conflicts around the world, including in Ukraine, whereby this group is entering the void that has been left by France and the West, and forging new alliances and using it to promote Russia's geopolitical interests. And we're going to see, and China has been doing the same across Africa, lucrative infrastructure projects in exchange for votes in the General Assembly, or support for Chinese strategic interests such as Taiwan. And so we're seeing more and more a shift in this world order. And as you say, Africa, Africa is there's a lot of investment happening. There's a lot of economic opportunity, and who is that going to benefit? In the past, it was automatically assumed that it would, that it would benefit the West, and because those investments were made by the IMF and the World Bank. That's no longer true. Russia's making investments in security. China's making investments in infrastructure, and they're asking for
Special
payback.
privileges, returns,
Exactly.
very
Exactly.
interesting alliances that could be formed. I think it's very important, and hopefully people will, make notes while they read their book and debate and discuss with you when they meet you, hopefully in person or through the Twitterverse. What are the implications for India, and are there any other geopolitical lessons you want to, talk about from Breakup?
Sure. I wrote an article some years ago about India in Africa, and what struck me was that India has a long history in Africa. The British Empire brought Indian indentured laborers to East Africa to build railways, and so there are Indian communities in East Africa and South Africa, and across the continent, really. But and in countries like Kenya, Indians have a huge part. They play a huge part in the economy, and yet the Indian government has been noticeably absent. It has not tapped into this Indian diaspora. China has no diaspora to speak of, or very small compared to India, on continents like Africa, and yet China has made this huge push to and Russia as well, to forge relationships with African governments and to forge economic ties and cultural ties now. And India, despite this history that it could leverage, it struck me how it's sort of sat back and not leveraged that, not sought to build those relationships. And for me, it speaks to, India seems to not have had this imperial ambition to kind of, India's been, it seems to me, very content to manage affairs within its sort of general borders, and to not seek to play huge roles on other continents. And that seems to be playing out now. And I wonder what role India will play or wants to play in this new world order that is, taking shape before our eyes. And yeah, India seems very concerned on shaping that identity within its borders. What does it mean to be Indian? Which religion are you from? Which where have your people? Where do you trace your lineage? And those kinds of things. And this Hindu and Muslim divide that we're seeing that is more prominent in India now. That seems to be more of a concern, internal questions of identity, rather than sort of playing a greater role in the world. And I think to truly claim a place and truly find ourselves, we need both. We need both to craft that internal identity, and we need to have a perspective on what's happening in the world. Our world is too global for that. And part of that is sending out journalists and writing and telling the stories about the world in a way that makes sense to us, not in a way that makes sense to the West or other people. And China's doing that to some extent with Xinhua, their new global news agency. You find correspondents everywhere. They're trying in a small way. But India, I don't see that. And when I've asked Indian or even Singaporean TV channels to send me out and send out crews to report on the US, for example, when Trump was elected, I asked a Singaporean national broadcaster, Channel News Asia, to send me out to the US, and they said, "Oh, why don't you report on Indians in America?" And I said, "No, I want to report on America." They said, "How about Asian tycoons in America?" And I said, "No, I want to report on America." And to me, that struck me as a smallness in the mind. They don't feel that we have the authority as Asians to report on the West in the same way that the West has an authority to report on us. And I think that has to change. We have to change that in a very profound way. If we're to claim our own identity, and if we're to fulfill the potentials that our nations have, and propose other alternative ways of development, of thinking about the world, of religion, of culture, we can't rely on the West for all of these things. And I see that happening, but I wish it would happen faster.
Any other final takeaways from the book? Anything people should keep in mind or think more about for the future?
I really appreciate our conversation. I think you're a person who's been very concerned with this question of passion versus security, and how you make these life choices, how you've made those life choices yourself. I was very interested to read your story. You'd worked at Microsoft for many years, and then in a very structured, thoughtful way, you took that leap to create Network Capital and to ask yourself, what are the conditions that I need to meet in order to, what are the safety nets, what are the conditions that I need to meet so that I can psychologically feel comfortable doing what I feel needs to happen, in the world, where serving a need that needs to be met in the world. And I really admire that, and I find a lot of complicity, or that resonates with me a lot. That we could choose, you and I, and a whole bunch of people may be listening to this. We could choose to take an easier, well-trodden path that would, make our parents happy, that would fulfill all the roles we're expected to fill in society, and yet, it's not a reckless act. We listen to ourselves. We listen to that little voice in our heads that tells us we need to do something else, and we try to go about it in structured ways. And I appreciate that you asked me these questions about how I thought through those decisions, because they're not reckless. They are, thought through. There are safety nets. I'm not being foolish. I'm not being heroic in a crazy way either. As some people might cast it out to be. I'm making very measured decisions, taking little steps. It's just that after 10 years, those steps add up. And now we can talk about it here. We've made those steps. And so, but if you go back and think about them, each of those steps was very frightening, and but very important. And we each needed to find the mentors. We needed to find the friends, the family, the connections to help, the voices to help support us on those journeys. And I think all of these things help us discover and connect with who we are. And when we connect with who we are, we connect with the rest of the world. And I think those are, in Hindu philosophy, in most religions, we talk about that. We come to a state where we feel one with the world. And I think this journey is very much trying to actualize that. And that's what I would leave, listeners with, to try and create those conditions to listen to yourself and connect with the world in whatever way feels right to you. And you've done that with Network Capital. I've done that with my work, my books, my reporting. And so I'm grateful to find and meet people who think in similar ways, and to share our journeys and help each other as we can.
I think that's the dream. Anjan, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed your candor and your insights through this conversation and your books. I think you've become even more suitable, I would say, after being published in New York Times and Foreign Policy, having best-selling books. So I think you have redeemed yourself. It's okay to quit Goldman Sachs and do your thing. But even if you don't get published in the New York Times, I feel still it's worth it. And I think that's the point that we want to make through this conversation, that success, the slow compounding, is a very painful one, but it's worth it. And even if the results, take a while, I think it's still worth it, because there's pleasure in the pursuit. I hope everyone takes away that from the conversation we just had.
Thank you, Utkarsh.